Hey there, welcome. Thanks for being here. Coming off a bit of a hiatus with this one, as just client work just got incredibly busy over the past 2 months, but it has gotten to a point where I can sort of come back and do this sort of stuff. So, in this video, we're going to talk about how to take a hybrid approach to your training following a 5-day split across the week. And we'll talk about two different ways that I pretty much always program this if I'm going to write someone a 5-day uh, program that is oriented towards strength and endurance. Now, another thing too, one of the things that made me think to sort of make this video, as well as the article that accompanies this, of which will be linked down below, is that on my website, one of the things you'll find is that I offer for free a number of different training programs oriented towards building strength and endurance simultaneously that are delineated based on the number of training days per week that they contain. One that has been downloaded the most by people is the one that's 5 days across the week. So I wanted to make this video and the accompanying article to sort of talk a bit more about, how I'm going to think through a training split across the week, why I think this is enough to accomplish this goal, and everything else therein. So as always, this is the sort of plan for the video. First, we'll talk about what the minimum effective dose of training for both strength, muscle growth, and endurance are, because that'll sort of lend to the idea that 5 days is enough to accomplish this goal. Then we'll talk about load management, just as a general idea and the sort of guidelines that I'm okay to give you right now. I say guidelines because I shouldn't put rules here, but guidelines is a better term, because sometimes you'll be, a little fuzzy with them, and that's okay. Load management is a concept that really means everything in terms of performance, injury risk reduction, good programming, etc. So it is something that I intend to make a whole in-depth article and video on at some point soon in the future. So if you're interested in that, join the newsletter, subscribe, anything like that. Newsletter's down below, by the way. Then we'll talk about the training splits, which is sort of an application of all this information down here. There are a number of references I'm going to use to sort of support the information on these first three slides primarily. So if you're interested in that, all that can be linked in the description box below, as well as in the accompanying article that is also going to be linked down below. So when I say the minimum effective dose of training, what I'm saying is the least amount of exercise you can do of a specific type of exercise and still see results and adaptations to that exercise over time. So in terms of volume for resistance training, with resistance training meaning training for muscle growth, training for strength, lifting weights for all intents and purposes, volume is best defined as the number of sets that are taken near failure. So think like 1 to 3 reps shy of failure or to failure, the number of sets per muscle group or per movement done across the entire week. Part of the reason why volume is best measured that way is that most evidence now seems to suggest that it does not matter how many reps you do in a set. If you get 2 reps shy of failure, and let's say you do a set of 5 and you could have done 7, or you do a set of 15 and you could have done 17, the results you get from each of those 2 sets is going to be exactly the same. It doesn't really matter. Proximity to failure, your effort, is what matters. And when you look at volume through this lens, it is the most sort of predictable way to predict, that's a weird way to say that, but how volume is going to have results over time. Again, I have another video sort of talking to that idea a bit more specifically, which I'll link down below if you are interested. For the purpose of hypertrophy or muscle growth, 4 sets per muscle group per week has been shown to be the sort of, for most people, the least amount you can do per week and still see results. Now, granted, that's really not that much. So if you think, say, 2 sets of chest on Monday, 2 sets of chest on Thursday, both taken, kind of close to failure, and that's enough. And that's enough to see growth in your chest over time. Now, granted, there's more muscle groups than just your chest, but I just say that to illustrate that, it's very manageable. It's not that much training. And it lends to the idea that 5 days is enough to get that done. Strength is, I say 2 to 3 sets per movement per week, because typically the main difference between muscle growth and strength in terms of training goals is that with strength, you're training movements as like the mindset. Muscle growth, you're training muscle groups. But besides that, they're really the same adaptation, and there's far more overlap than not. But most of the evidence suggests that 2 to 3 sets is kind of the number there. So if you do, let's say, 2 sets of squats on Monday, 2 sets of squats on Thursday, both, taken to an intense close to failure, you will see your squat strength increase over time. And just to add, these numbers, as well as for this point down here, which I'll speak to in a second, are all done in trained people. So, the study I'm using to support this is done on military recruits. These up here are done in either just general bodybuilding oriented lifters or powerlifters is what this one I'm drawing from. So, all that to say, it's not like these are novice trainees who are going to, and, that's important because people who are highly trained, you would imagine that they were going to need more, whether it's more intensity, more volume, more something. But the fact that this isn't that much and this isn't trained people just lends more to the idea that you don't really need as much as most people think to see results over time, as long as you're consistent, in some way, shape, or form. Endurance is a little more nuanced because it does depend on, endurance for a 5K versus endurance for a marathon are going to look very different, really, in terms of how you adapt to them, but also how you train, how you maintain them, stuff like that. Just a general rule of thumb is that the higher the distance of the event that you want to maintain your endurance adaptations to, the more volume you might need to maintain those adaptations, but the less of a distance you're trying to maintain, the less volume you're going to need, which makes sense, but it's still worth saying. What I will say is that a 5-day per week training split that is, hybrid in nature might not be enough to really optimally train for a marathon per se. I mean, you could do it. There's ways you could do it, but it's tricky. But half marathon is far more than doable. By extension, obviously 10K, 5K, and anything of that, let's say 2 hour or less overall duration is going to be very manageable of a sort of distance or duration of endurance event to train for it. Now, granted, you obviously don't need an endurance event you're training for, but I just say that to say that it is still plenty of time available in the week to build your endurance over time. So again, load management is kind of a nuanced idea, and I am going to work on a more in-depth article and video that sort of speaks to this topic in detail. But just for right now, load, you can think of it as the amount of stress being placed on the body. And you can think of it in terms of being placed on the local area, like your quads, or the system at large, which is you. And load, at least how it's talked about in the research, takes into account not just your training load, but your sleep, your stress, your nutrition, all that stuff, like the overall load. I don't really know if there's a better term for that right now, but the load being placed on the body from all facets of life. The idea is that you want to place the appropriate amount of load on your body at a given point in time over time in order to see the progress you want to see. Placing too much load than you are currently prepared for increases your risk of injury. Placing too little means you might not see the results you're after, if any at all, which again, it had to be very little based on what we just talked about, but nevertheless. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to jump right over here. There are a number of different sort of guidelines that these can be, played with a little bit. And I'm going to play with them a little bit in the splits to follow. But in any case, this is a good starting point. High intensity running, that can be defined as, let's say a 20-minute run done at max effort, or so, say maybe you're doing 2 minutes easy, 2 minutes max effort run, repeating that for 3 to 5 times, where if you do that right, you're going to be absolutely cooked after. That is high intensity running, something that really makes you huff and puff, that you can't sustain for, more than 4 minutes at a time, something like that. Very stressful. That sort of, lactate threshold glycolytic type of training is some of the most stressful training you can impose on your body overall. So that's why, if in a perfect world, you give yourself 72 hours of rest before you really train your legs intensely or for a long period of time, or prolonged period of time being akin to something like a long run. Now, understand this plays to the idea that the entire session is high intensity running. We're gonna play with this a little bit, where we're gonna add like a little taste of high intensity conditioning into some of the splits coming up. So there is like a volume dependency of how much in high intensity work you're actually doing. But if you're doing a true, like 20, 30 minute lactate threshold type of training, you're going to need some good recovery from that. And in regard to some of the nomenclature I'm using here, I'm saying running and saying legs because those are going to be kind of the main two that are hard to sort of mesh together. And so I speak to those directly because it's going to, I think, help the most people watching this. But you can assume when I say high intensity running, I'm really referring to high intensity conditioning of any kind. So if it's like you're on an Airdyne or something like that, that would also apply there. Strength training, any muscle group, I should say, as opposed to just legs, should be given at least 40 hours before it is used intensely again. And when I say intensely, that could mean strength training again, or that could mean high intensity conditioning type of training again. Long running or, long endurance training, think of anything longer than like 90 minutes or so is a fair enough rule of thumb for that. With that type of training, the primary limiter to your recovery is going to be the speed at which your body can replenish the carbohydrate stores that were depleted during the session. So, based on that, usually 24 hours is a fair enough rule of thumb, meaning that if you do like a long-ish type of training on Sunday, you probably can do a strength training run or session, not strength training run, on Monday. Now, you might have to, take into account what that each session actually looks like, but it's not unreasonable to say that. Short to moderate distance conditioning or easy running. So let's say a long run for you is 10 hours, just to put an example on it. Short to moderate distance would be something like 3 to 5 or 6-ish miles, something like that, just to make this a bit more clear. This can be done really anywhere. This is it's not going to impose a lot of stress on the system. It's not going to require a lot of recovery. So as long as there's it's not done before any of this stuff. And so therefore your performance is really inhibited, or of this stuff is being dragged down by just being a little pre-fatigued. You can program these really wherever you want. You can be very liberal because, again, it's not going to really stress the system too much. And I bring this all up because hopefully understanding this helps you be a bit more structured in, how you write things for yourself if you're writing, your own programs. But also, too, is going to lend to why I structure the things the way I do in the option or the training splits coming up right now. So this first option is really a full body kind of routine from a strength training lifting perspective with some conditioning interspersed in between. So the way I like to program this when I'm running a program for one of my clients is that first day. So let's say this is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or rest days, just to have an example week in your head. Power, strength, and anaerobic conditioning. So power could be plyometrics, like vertical jumps, could be pogos, things like that. Strength, I like to have this as a bit more of a strength focus. So, think your deadlifts, your squats, your overhead presses, your benches, whatever the case may be, probably going to be a bit lower volume here, I think, to, make this most appropriate. And anaerobic conditioning, one of the ways I like to program this is, so say you're on a rower. Say you start off with 30 seconds, easy. You're just kind of going 4 out of 10 effort, 30 seconds near max effort, and you repeat that 4 times for a total of 4 minutes, and then that's it. So it's not like that full 20, 30 minute, lactate threshold type of training I talked about before, where I said you would need 72 hours. It's still that kind of training, but just like a taste of it. Part of the reason why I like this is because I do think there is value to getting exposed to those higher heart rates, that, higher intensity type of conditioning work, but it requires, when it's done to its full extent, it requires a lot of recovery. And so it's kind of a messy thing to program. But in my opinion, for most people, this is going to get you a lot of the benefits with just this little taste tacked on to the end of a session like this, without really requiring all of the recovery demands that a full session would require. Aerobic conditioning for day 2 and day 4, this could be done on a bike. This could be an easy run. This could be an Airdyne. It really depends on what your goal is and what you're trying to achieve, and in regard to your exercise selection for this, but it should be truly aerobic and not necessarily too difficult per se. Now, heart rate targets really depend on a lot of things, with one of the things being exercise selection, but being somewhere between 100 to 140 beats per minute as your sort of intensity target for this, for let's say 30 to 60-ish minutes would be a good sort of place to be. And then when I say full body hypertrophy, really just standard strength training for the goal of training muscle groups, training for muscle growth in a full body fashion. Again, you have a good 40 hours in between each muscle group is going to be trained here. So it's still in line with the load management principles I spoke to before. And the only rule I would say, if you want to take this sort of split and apply it to your own life, is that the rest days can be placed wherever you want, as long as you're not training strength of any same muscle group 2 days in a row, for the same reason I spoke about before when we were talking about load management. So don't do day 1 and then go immediately into day 5. Have at least a rest day or an aerobic conditioning day if you really want to get crazy. But that's the only rule that I would say for this training split. Now, in the accompanying article for this video that is linked down below, I do have, a more full out example written where I give you example sessions of what all this might look like. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. And this is the second option. In this split, that day 1 of power, strength, and anaerobic conditioning would look almost identical to the day 1 in the first option that I gave you. Day 4 and day 5 would be your very stereotypical lower body day, upper body day. It would probably be best to take somewhat of a hypertrophy muscle growth type of focus with these days also, since this is kind of your more, archetypical strength and conditioning type of day. Now, really, these could be aerobic conditioning of any kind. It doesn't have to be lower body and upper body delineated in this way. But one of the things I like about this type of split, if I'm using this framework when I'm writing for a client, is that it makes a very easy way to program upper body aerobic conditioning. So something like swimming, something like a skier, or even sleds, rowers to some degree, stuff like that. Your legs are, for obvious reasons, much more able to handle high volumes and, aerobic type training because we use them to walk everywhere. So they just, by default are built that way. It's very helpful and very beneficial and important, I would say, to aerobically train your upper body as well. But you're going to feel a bit more of a recovery need, from a 20-minute moderate intensity swim than you would from a 20-minute moderate intensity run. So in my experience, I find that people tend to feel better when you have this sort of separation, if this is possible. So if you want to train something like swimming, if you want to train a skier or anything else that I said before, I think this makes a lot of sense. The only downside of this type of split would be It's obviously not as flexible as the first one. So if we go back to this first one, there we go. So, if life happens, let's say work gets busy, kids have a soccer game, whatever the case may be, and you have to miss day 5, you still have plenty of resistance training volume across day 1 and day 3 to still see results over time. If life happens and you miss day 5 here, you miss a big chunk of your upper body volume for the week. So I think this split makes more sense if you are very confident that you're going to make all of the sessions across the week, and it's going to be rare that you're going to miss a session in a week. Now, granted, you can just, given that these are 5-day splits, you can just push these back a day, but it's still worth bringing that up, I think, as a consideration. Again, same thing here. Don't do day 1, day 5 back to back, because you don't want to train upper body 2 days in a row in an intense fashion. But apart from that, the rest days kind of, take care of themselves just by way of the split for the same reason that I spoke about before. Those are the 2 hybrid training splits that are 5 days per week that I think are the best, that I use the most with clients, and that I would recommend to you. Again, if you want to see these splits sort of applied and with actual sample sessions, check out the article below that is going to have that written down, because it got a bit wordy if I put that here. Again, all references are going to be linked down below. And if you liked this video, you found this helpful, you would love the newsletter, in which I give my best training and nutrition tips every Friday at 9 a.m. So that can be checked down below. And I'm going to end this here. Thanks for being here, and I will speak to you soon.